Welcome to Democracy Nerd. I am Jefferson Smith. Here we talk about the democracy ledger, movements and policies that expand democracy, extend rights and liberties, as well as the other side of that ledger, efforts and institutions intent on curtailing those rights and liberties and powers of human beings to control their government. Today, we're talking about the Supreme Court. We would love to. And in fact, when I studied the history of the Supreme Court, it seemed like it was a historical arc that put it in the pro-democracy side of that ledger. Recent history is a different story. Are the days of the Supreme Court serving as a bastion of democracy, expanding access to rights and liberties, just a fond remembrance? Is there hope for the future, or what might be the hope for the future of that institution? To explore some of these questions, we're joined by Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center of Justice at New York University, author of the new book, Supermajority, How the Supreme Court Divided America. It's coming out right away. Michael, first of all, thank you so much for your work. You are a legend in these parts, and welcome to Democracy Nerd.
Thank you so much. Really glad to be with you.
So before we get into the book, let's talk a little bit about you. Remind listeners and about the Brennan Center, but even let me just go a little bit backwards from there. How'd you get into this mess? How did you start doing the stuff that led you to the Brennan Center?
You know, it didn't occur to me that the health of our democracy would be something I could spend any part of my career on. I'm an attorney and a writer, and actually my background is more than anything else before this in government and politics. I was chief speechwriter for President Bill Clinton when he was in the White House worked with him for both terms. Got a chance to see how you can move public opinion on key issues, but it was also a time when a lot of the central and core questions about our democracy seemed to have been resolved. I came to the Brennan Center in 2005 after practicing law and teaching, and have been here ever since. And our basic premise is that there are very basic, fundamental ways in which the systems of democracy and justice in this country are not working as they should, and are not working for all people, and that we're partly a think tank and partly a legal advocacy group and partly a communications hub, and that we want to try to do what we can to strengthen those systems.
So you were at the Kennedy School just after I was at the law school. We missed each other by about a year. When did you, in terms of that arc, because it hasn't been 20 years at the Brennan Center, but it's been a spell. What were sort of key inflection points, or when did you start thinking that, oh, wait a minute, how I've imagined the law, how I've imagined sort of we've reached the culmination of democracy, roughly speaking, or, things are feel like kind of on the upswing, and the Supreme Court is an institution that will protect that. When did you start getting more meaningfully pessimistic?
Well, it's interesting. So, in some ways, law school is the worst place to train people to understand the law and the Constitution. It's obviously the best or the only way in some other respects, but the story, as I've come to understand it, is that the Supreme Court has not been the leading force for democracy for most of the country's history. And now the Brennan Center for Justice, which is affiliated with NYU School of Law, is named after Justice William Brennan, who was the great liberal on the court, was one of the leaders of the Warren Court era in the mid-20th century. And the Brennan Center is about 26 years old now. And it was in tribute to him, not necessarily his specific goals or views, but the general spirit that the law needed to be for people. And when Brennan was on the court, they really were doing things that had needed to be done for a long time. School desegregation. Brennan was the author of the opinion on one person, one vote, which said that if you're going to have a meaningful representative democracy, people's votes had to count more or less the same, and you had to have, therefore, roughly equally divided legislative districts. but that court that Brennan was a part of was really something of an anomaly, a very unusual and very brief period in the country's history. A book I wrote a few years ago called The Fight to Vote, sort of to my surprise, learned that the Supreme Court usually didn't have much of a role in strengthening America's democracy, and it didn't usually always have such a bad role either, but it was never the lead. The lead was legislatures, Congress, presidents, and especially people on the streets and public opinion. But when I was in law school, ahead of you, for sure, issues like voting rights, that was kind of ancient history. Things seemed certainly quite settled. I worked on the issues when I was in government of money and politics, and that was just a period when the huge volume of money was flooding into the political system in ways that now would seem quaint, but at the time seemed pretty big and bad. But a lot of these even more basic and more fundamental issues of representative democracy, these first principles, they were not anything that were in contention. There was a public consensus around these things. And so, I came to the Brennan Center in 2005. A lot of these current democracy fights really started, I think, around the time of the Florida recount in 2000, when Bush and Gore were basically genuinely tied. And we learned in that several week period, looking at the craziness in Florida, that the system there was really rather ramshackle, and there were all kinds of ways people had been blocked from voting and ways you could manipulate things. And I think a lot of people woke up at that moment to how ramshackle our democratic system was, and that it was something you could try to manipulate for advantage. And so pretty soon thereafter, this first rumblings of false claims of voter fraud started to be heard. And of course, that's grown and grown and grown and has transformed into an anti-democratic movement of a kind we haven't seen in our country in a long time.
When you started you were a public citizen prior to?
Before I worked in the government, I was the executive director of Public Citizens Congress Watch, which was, the good government and consumer advocacy group that had long ago been started by Ralph Nader.
Yeah. At the Brennan Center, it seemed that things are changing. A recent conversation, it came up again, but for so long, for those of us who prioritize things like money and politics, as you've shown leadership on, sort of democracy, systemic issues, right? Democracy itself, not merely what it rots. That so often the critique or the response from let's say a candidate that one is advising, or the consultant that is advising that candidate, is that's tertiary, it's secondary. That's not the real thing. We've got to be dealing with somebody's healthcare. We got to be dealing with somebody's wages, the price at the grocery store.
You're so right.
And what's the democracy schmocracy? I need a drop to drink. What has been your favorite response to that? And or do you feel that arc changing a little bit with January 6th is maybe the most obvious, almost comic book villain example of the change? But yeah, how do you think about that?
So it's a great question, and I'm having lifetime flashbacks. You're exactly right, and I always used to say that our mission at the Brennan Center was to move the issue of democracy to the center of public debate. Now I say, we mean like this, so the world,
you are successful.
The world has conspired to make it central. When I first started working on these issues, you're absolutely right that so many people in the political professional class would tell the politicians, and it was often the politicians themselves, but it was even more often the consultants who worked for them and spent their money. They would say, oh, this is nice stuff, this kind of goo-goo, good government, hygienic, interesting topic, but nobody in the public cares. Nobody cares about this stuff. Nobody cares about the Constitution. At least Democrats didn't, or progressives didn't. What people care about is kitchen table issues. It was a notion of the public as they wanted stuff. They wanted important stuff. They wanted pharmaceutical prices to go down, or they wanted, other things, but they didn't care about this. This was arcane. This was boring and too abstract. And first off, one thing that was pretty clear even then was that voters understood that if the system was broken, if the system was not working for everybody, if it was clogged up and dominated by money or by special interests, then they weren't going to get those other goodies that were being promised. Voters in that way were absolutely ahead of the elected politicians in understanding the causation. And if you remember, in 1992, when I worked for Clinton and he was elected president, Ross Perot got 19% of the vote that year as a third-party candidate, even though he was quite plainly eccentric, to put it mildly. But a lot of what he talked about were these issues, interestingly, of political reform in ways that I actually found quite compelling. The voters, there was a big chunk of the electorate that was independent, that understood this stuff, that cared about this stuff, that became sort of the jump ball in American politics and often would help set the terms of who would win these elections. And over time, you had first of all you had the growing assault on voting rights, going back 15 years, with false claims of voter fraud, often very racialized, often pretty clearly an effort, I would say, to make it harder for Black people and Latinos and other people of color to vote. And in a way, that's kind of the oldest story the country has. And it's not new, of course, and we wish it was not something current, but that culminated with the Shelby County decision by the Supreme Court in 2013, gutting the Voting Rights Act. After it had last passed the House and Senate unanimously. In the Senate, it passed 98-0, but in 2006. But by 2013, you had the Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act. And we've had those fights and these efforts to make it harder for many Americans to vote playing out. But then in the last several years, I think we see something new and also very scary, which is this newly anti-democratic, newly authoritarian strain represented by Trump, represented by the people who stormed the Capitol. It's obviously tied in with their backlash and white nationalism in many cases, but it really basically doesn't even pay lip service to the premises of American democracy. And you see this with the insurrection. You see this with these efforts to pass laws to change who counts the votes. You see this in the efforts to take away the authority of prosecutors from going after political corruption. And this is the same kind of anti-democratic movement we're seeing, not just in our country, but all over the world, whether in Russia or in Hungary or in Turkey, or it's playing out over and over and over again. And it is especially unnerving because it supercharges the longstanding vote suppression into something that takes on not just the suppression of votes, but the repudiation of elections.
I think back to the Barack Obama campaign number one, presidential campaign number one, where his campaign learned from focus groups that before people would trust his message to change healthcare or save the environment, that he had to include, first, we have to change Washington. And then he'd have to go through how, some of this process stuff, some of this good government stuff, some of this pro-democracy itself stuff. Why do you think consultants were so behind? Why? I mean, these are not dumb people. These are paid professionals. These are people who are who rise typically from being successful on other campaigns and realize they don't want to just do campaign work all the time and they want to get paid more. And they're trying to be right. Why do you think they missed it?
First of all, I hope that's changed somewhat. I think that the Democrats at least now understand not only this is important, but that the politics behind it is powerful as well. My experience back when I was in Democratic politics, which is now several decades ago, but I don't think it's changed all that much, is it was often the people who raised the money understood how important these issues were. They saw the see me side of it. The politicians frequently did as well, although they were also risk averse and thinking as incumbents more than anything else. And the consultants always, very literally read the polls or thought of their own self-interest or whatever and told their clients, oh, nobody cares. Even President Obama, who understood this and in so many ways, when he came into office, he did not prioritize voting rights or democracy reform or campaign finance. He was the first major party candidate in decades not to take public financing for his campaign. There are many reasons why he might not have, but he really did not. And that was actually an unfortunate thing. He had the least aggressive push for democracy reform of any Democratic president, basically, as far as I could tell, since Grover Cleveland. Part of the result is what we see now. So here's the change. Here's the arc, as you asked about.
Yeah,
I think right now, and January 6th was an eye-opening experience for so many. Many people, mainstream people in politics, understand that these democracy issues are absolutely central. We saw in 2021 and early 2022, the Democrats, for the first time in half a century, putting forward really strong democracy reform legislation in the Freedom to Vote Act and John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. They eventually got smushed together, but there were two bills and they became one bill that would set national standards on elections, that would restore the strength of the Voting Rights Act, end dark money in campaigns, and ban gerrymandering, partisan or racial gerrymandering nationwide. It was H.R. 1. It was the #1 bill for the Democrats in both the House and the Senate. Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer really fought really hard for it. We worked closely with both of them, and it came much closer than people realize. Most people. It passed the House. President Biden was eager to sign it. It had a majority in the Senate. As you know, only 2 senators, Democratic senators, refused to change the rules so that the bill could pass with that majority, and so it didn't become law. But people say, well, Manchin and Sinema, you knew they were going to do that, right? Why didn't you know that was going to happen? Well, at the beginning of the year, there were 10 Democratic senators who didn't want to change the rules, but who came to the conclusion that voting rights and democracy reform was that important. Right now, there is a strong sentiment among Democratic senators, for example, to change the filibuster rules the next time they have a chance to pass this legislation. And I always remind everybody that voting rights failed in 1957, and it failed in 1960. And it failed in 1964 before it became law in 1965. I really feel strongly the democracy reform will pass. I don't know when exactly, but sometime going forward. And the other thing that happened as a political matter that's really powerful and encouraging is, in the wake of January 6th, in the wake of the continued embrace of election denialism by Trump and so many of his supporters, it turns out it really matters a lot to voters. When you look at the 2022 midterm elections, a lot of people gave Biden, a lot of grief for saying this election is about democracy and about Dobbs, about the overturning of Roe v. Wade. He should talk about inflation, they said. Well, Democrats had the best midterm performance for a party in control of the White House in decades. And I was doing an event with a Republican pollster, Sarah Longwell. She's an anti-Trump Republican, but she was doing focus groups of independent voters and soft Republicans. And she said she'd ask them, what issues do you care about? And the people would say, well, I care about inflation, crime is up, the border is out of control, whatever. And she would say, oh, so then are you voting for Blake Masters? And the respondents would say, no, he's crazy. He's an election denier. And he's for overturning Roe v. Wade. He's really extreme. They understood in their own minds the connection between the extremism, the attack on democracy, and the attack on people's rights. And again, they were ahead of a lot of the politicians. So that gives me some hope.
Yeah, the smartest analysis I saw post those congressional elections was sort of looking at the overlay of where both things were on the ballot. For instance, where there was a Secretary of State running and voting rights or January 6th, or was a congressional race with election denialism that therefore was kind of on the ballot, and a governor's race, for instance, or of course a congressional race where it looked like Roe versus Wade was on the ballot, where both things happened. That it was. I'm sure it wasn't a perfect map, but it seemed a really powerful indicator of where Democrats overperformed mid-presidential term expectations. And you also said something about Donald Trump, something I noticed about Donald Trump when he was running the first time, not running against Biden, but when he was running against Hillary Clinton. That much of his campaign, much of what he was talking about was the corruption of Washington.
Drain the swamp.
Much of what he was talking about was a different song out of Ross Perot's hymnal, which by the way had overlap with Ralph Nader's hymnal, which by the way had notes in Barack Obama's campaign. Although to your point, candidates who become successful even with that message haven't always succeeded in fulfilling those promises, and we've seen that at the national level as well as the state level. So I'm with you. It's one of the reasons I'm a fan is that I do see the tide turning. I do think the commitment. I mean, women's suffrage didn't happen on the first crack either, right? It took over and over and over again. In my state, I think it was 5 times before women's suffrage passed in my state. I want to ask you about how it's impacting your work, how it's manifesting in your work, and including in fundraising. Because one of the challenges, so I had to raise money before, right? And I've raised money for pro-democracy organizations and for political campaigns, as well as for startup companies, and including trying to help with campaigns to do campaign finance restrictions, right? Including money in politics, money in politics, ballot measures, right? Local initiatives, and there's always sort of a tricky thing to say, and I don't find it all that tricky, but I understand how it can feel that way to say we get money out of politics. A line I don't like, by the way, which I can say why. And then the other hand says that's why I need you to give me 10 grand.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think about and I don't think it's that hard, right? I don't think it's that hard to be honest, to be able to say, yeah, it requires resource to do this work. We want to make sure that people with resource don't have overweening power, not because the resource isn't important, but because it is so very important. I don't think that's that asynchronous, but I'm interested in how it's manifesting in your work. Are you seeing greater interest in the Brennan Center? Is your work harder or easier?
The Brennan Center is bigger than we've ever been. We have a staff of about 160 now.
Wow.
We're affiliated with NYU Law School, but we're our own entity. We raise our own money. There's considerable support from donors. We actually get overwhelmingly our support from people, from individuals, not from foundations, for example. About 70% of our support is from individuals. We now have about 40,000 donors, which is a lot more than we used to. But the biggest measure to me of the public's hunger for this stuff is our ability to get our ideas and these issues out into the world. We now have, for example, 350,000 subscribers to our newsletters. And this is not spam, this is opt-in. You have to check a box and say you want this stuff. And it's pretty, nutritious spam in the sense that it's very, we send out all our material with all its footnotes and all the legal and political science heaviness that we sometimes have in our work, and people are really, really engaged. And that's
eat your broccoli. You serve them peas, broccoli,
and we give our reports deliberately boring titles just to make the point clear. But it's so I think the public understands it, and I think the point you made about how to talk about money in politics, because I certainly don't ever want us to lose touch with how central that issue is. I mean, in some ways, some of the garish restrictions on voting need to be fought, but they're at least visible to the naked eye. Some of the impact of money of course, is not only felt in the elections, but certainly felt in the outcomes of elections and in the policies that come out of government. When we talk about money in politics, I emphatically agree. It's both, it's a mistake and it's not achievable to say we've got to get money out of politics. There's always going to be money in politics, but the question is, where is it coming from, and what kind of consequences does it have, and does it create a completely uneven playing field, and does it lead to policies that favor just further enriching the wealthy? And so that one of the reasons, therefore, that we strongly support small donor public financing as the most important solution, and we just had a pretty significant win on that in New York State in what was the most significant legislative change after Citizens United, which is we have a system now that's going into effect in New York where small contributions get a multiple match.
Yep.
And it hasn't started yet, but and a number of the state legislators, upon realizing, wait a minute, we did what? Tried to back out of it, but nevertheless, it's going to go into effect now, I'm happy to say. And that doesn't pretend to get all the money out, but what it does is it gives smaller donors and ordinary people a much potentially louder, amplified voice. So I think there's a kind of an empowering and a pro-people way of talking about it. It's also constitutionally better than kind of, as the Supreme Court has ruled, they don't like the kinds of restrictions on contributions and other things and spending that fall afoul of their doctrines. But at least so far, this is something they have said is constitutional.
So I should give a little bit here. I come by this, I'll say honestly, that my dad gave a speech for what he called, I think he called Patriot Dollars in, I think it was 1972. It might have been 1976, which was essentially the same plan, very, very similar to the plan that Seattle executed with their sort of democracy voucher system.
The vouchers.
And there was a bill in Oregon that you could check off $1 and give it to the political party of your choice right on your tax form. And it had a sunset in it. And the reason it had a sunset is that back in the time about 1980, the then Democrat Speaker of the House, who became the Democrat who was the Attorney General, was asked, well, why does this bill have a sunset in it? He said, oh, because by the time the sunset happens, we're going to have publicly financed elections. And I agree with you about its importance. I'll give you a talking point. So this has been dancing around literally in my family living room since I was born, right? And so it's almost therapeutically important to me, right? It's almost edibly important to me, hopefully in a positive way. I'll give you a talking point that on the topic. When somebody would say, get the money out of politics, what my dad would say is, he ran for Attorney General, didn't take any contributions over $99.99. And people would say, oh yeah, you want to get money out of politics? He said, no. We're not getting money out of politics. That's not my point. Think about how much money one has to spend. Take Coca-Cola, for instance. How much money does Coca-Cola have to spend to get people to buy a can of Coke, something that they can buy any day of the year in any number of thousands and thousands and thousands of locations at any time of day, and gives them a little bit of sweet taste in their lips? They spend untold millions and millions and millions on communicating that. And it's a very simple message. How much resource do we have to spend in helping people figure out how and when and why to go somewhere to a very particular place, to do a very particular thing that doesn't give any obvious, immediate sweet taste in your lips and is more complex than drinking a can of Coke? We have to spend real resource on that. What we have to be concerned about is where that money is coming from, what motivates that money, what it's yielding, and it's persuaded me ever since. And I offer it.
And going back to the point you made about, how are people reacting in terms of support for these issues? I would say the pro-democracy movement, and there is a democracy movement now facing off against this election denier movement, and it's bigger and deeper and more vibrant than I've seen in a long, long time. And it's had support, financial support, but far less than you might expect from, again, the foundations and others. I used to look at the Federalist Society, which of course did more than anybody else to stack the federal courts with real reactionary judges. And we're living in the world that they are making right now. I used to look at the Federalist Society and say, well, they don't seem to have that much money. How are they? They're really pretty impressive in how they do this without such a gigantic budget. Then it turns out that someone had given Leonard Leo, the leader of the Federalist Society, secretly $1.6 billion with a B, and that they were swimming in money, and that a massive, massive amount of financial effort is going into turning the courts into exactly what they've become, which is an engine against American democracy. And so there's a lot of money on the other side. And even though there is support on our side of these issues, I would say not nearly enough.
I was talking very recent conversation. I was saying, the describing, and I think maybe understating the amount of money that is being spent to sort of controvert, to oppose democracy. And I try not to be glib about it, but if our concern is secret money, why do we think we know about it all? Right. And thank you to ProPublica for sort of unearthing that story. But the big secret money doesn't send a press release about its generous contributions. A little bit on mapping the pro-democracy movement. So I remember working with was actually a conservative, for the most part, conservative lobbyist, and we happened to be tenuously on the same side on a water bill because we were trying to get resources for water development, which is something that I still think that my old line was that that rural Republicans or urban Democrats under prioritize water resources, and rural Republicans are under comfortable paying for it and regulating it. Mm-hmm. And so we were working on this water bill, and he had and their lobbying team had a sort of a nice guy lobbyist, and they had him. And they described it as, well, that guy's the State Department, I'm the War Department. And I think about the pro-democracy movement as being, I don't know about replete, probably not full, but having folks in the State Department, because it does attract, maybe even going back to our consultant conversation, it does attract people to say, listen, I am here because I want a non-Ronald Reagan version of a shining city on a hill. I want a gleaming democracy of Aristotelian justice, right? I'm not trying to just get in the fight with some political machine. And I understand that instinct because I share it to some degree, right? Our identities can be, no, we're not we're motivated by this work so that we aren't just in the muck, because we don't think it should all be about the muck. And at the same time, I wonder, who's the War Department, right? Maybe that's elements of the Brennan Center. And I found it interesting, by the way, they kept it separate, right? And even when I was advising another nonprofit organization, I said, part of your challenge is that because you are filing so many lawsuits, when you go and lobby, the people who you might need to compromise with don't trust you because you've been suing them. I'm not saying they shouldn't get sued, but you might divide that up. You might have a State Department or a War Department that's a little bit separate. I know Mark Elias, for instance, is filing a bunch of lawsuits, right? That's an example. But on the campaign side, on the consultant side, on the fundraising side, to do not just C3 work, but C4 work, not just C4 work, but PAC work, not just winning the argument, but winning elections. And not just winning short-term elections, but over time election infrastructure. Who are the folks that people should be looking to, and describe your own role, of course, but who are the people should be looking to both on that kind of idea underpinning side, as well as that, winning stuff in the near and intermediate term side?
Well, and there is no one-stop shop.
Sure.
In the 1970s, for example, when the campaign finance laws, the public financing system for the presidential races was passed, it was pretty much Common Cause was the organization. It did everything. And there's nothing like that now. There's no one place that files the lawsuits and does the ideas and has the grassroots network and so on. Things are sort of disaggregated. And the Brennan Center, like so many, I would say, we don't do electoral work. In other words, we are nonpartisan and a 501c3 organization. That's the nonpartisan organization, as your listeners may know. And you know, our role is serving in a sense as a kind of an intellectual backbone for a lot of this.
Yeah. The links
Legal
you
work.
can cite with
There are
footnotes
other,
and titles.
there are other groups that are engaged, for example, in what they call accountability work, bringing lawsuits against malfeasors. And one of the groups we work with frequently these days is Protect Democracy, which is a pretty new one. There are the traditional or longstanding civil rights groups like the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights or the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, who are working and focusing, of course, especially on racial justice and using the courts for those things. There are groups like the League of Women Voters, or more recently, Fair Fight, which was Stacey Abrams' organization that she's established, who are focused more in the grassroots and in the states. A lot of different people doing a lot of different things. One of the things that with this book, The Supermajority, and in our work more broadly, is to encourage even this movement to understand that the Supreme Court has been captured by a faction of a faction, by a radical element. And it is not going to be a place where we're going to win big rulings in the future. It's closed off for a long time to a lot of these concerns. And it's an important part of telling the story to the public that so much of what they don't like about our political system, so much of the money-drenched politics, so much of the polarization that you see from gerrymandering and other things, so much of the voter suppression is enabled by the Supreme Court with a very explicitly ideological and in some cases political agenda. Making sure that people understand the Supreme Court itself is an institution like Congress or the presidency, say, that needs attention and change. That's another important kind of one more aspect of the arc of the story.
We just had our 76th episode, which we mildly celebrated because we're, patriots. And and over those, I've had a chance it's a learning experience to me. That's much why I do it. Right. And it gives me a chance to sort of connect dots. And I want to hypothesize, I think there might be a gap. And I think that gap could be filled. And I think you could be critical in helping it get filled. I think it would be different from the Brennan Center, but I think about the choice movement, for instance, right? That has NARAL and Planned Parenthood PACs. I think about the environmental movement with the League of Conservation Voters and the Sierra Club PACs. At the state level, I notice, and I think Stacey Abrams was doing something that was sort of a different thing, right? But I think about Common Cause here and League of Women Voters here, run by dear friends of mine and doing remarkable work. And when it comes time to, and we were looking for, no, we knew who they were. Well, we were looking for and wanting to say thank you to and support people who had been champions for democracy issues. And so hosted actually in my backyard, pretty traditional house party fundraiser for the state Senate's leading champion on campaign finance reform. And because he was in a close race. This wasn't in a general election. This wasn't somebody with a safe primary seat so they could do whatever. This is somebody actually who won their race in their minds in a deep purple district because they prioritize above all else democracy itself, including campaign finance reform. He said this is not the peas and carrots and broccoli merely. This is also the meat and potatoes. This is the center of what I'm doing. And the Common Cause and League of Women Voters lead staff people couldn't come because it was a political fundraiser. And that didn't bother me, right? Like I was like, you're doing exactly the thing. The fact that you're able to be an honest arbiter, somebody that can communicate with traditional press such that it still is, somebody that can be legitimately nonpartisan, that is critical not only to your brand, but who you are. And by the way, how I want democracy to work. I don't want everybody to be in the muck. And at the same time, there wasn't really anybody to call. There wasn't the PAC. There wasn't the consultant. There wasn't that sort of thing, at least in our state. So I'm interested in what's happening in New York, in other states, et cetera, because I think there's an opportunity to take some of this energy and make sure that that we're able to win some of those political fights? What am I missing, or what's out there, or what would you recommend to people in states?
I would say that at the national level, and I can't speak to state by state.
Yeah.
There's been, again, a positive change here, although it emphatically needs to be deepened and kept going. You've had in the last 4 years or so, for the first time, explicitly political action committees, 527s, forces that care about these issues as much as you do or I do. The PAC and 527 and Citizens United, for example, elected 40 House challengers in 2018, often talking about these issues. That is one of the reasons there was such a groundswell in the House Democratic Caucus for HR1 to make that bill as central as it was. A lot of and as I said, Pelosi in particular was really strong as a leader on this, but a lot of the other old-timey Democratic leaders were not. I had a conversation, well, I'll mention one other major national funding organization. These are both on the Democratic side. I should note, and there isn't as much on a kind of transpartisan way, but the group that Eric Holder started, the National Democratic Redistricting Coalition, looks at redistricting, pushes the interests of Democrats, and of course, Democrats and Republicans have gerrymandered as much as they could over the years. But in this moment, Holder and his organization have pushed hard for fair maps, for reform, even in some instances where it hurts the Democrats, because they want to make the point that overall fair maps are better. And they're doing it from a partisan perspective, but I think it's also the right substantive perspective. And both of those spend a lot of money in elections, and that's pretty new. One needs to keep pushing. In 2017, early 2018, I met, as the head of the Brennan Center, I met with Steny Hoyer, who was the number 2 Democrat at the time. And it was almost, I wasn't sure after the meeting whether he quite remembered who he was talking to, but he said, well, if we win, I'm either going to be speaker or majority leader, and I guess I'll be majority leader since Pelosi was not leaving. And he said, and if that happens, let me tell you what we're going to do. Not this being HR1, the democracy reform. So nobody cares. What people care about is infrastructure.
Wow.
And real issues. It was the same language one might hear for decades. Yep. Yet soon thereafter, enough pressure came from enough rank and file members of the Democratic caucus that he was standing there routinely supporting, pushing this legislation. I think that a missing piece is the White House. If there is another moment where the Democrats control the House and the Senate, which is possible, and the White House, certainly far from assured, that's putting it mildly, but it's certainly possible, then we need, including from President Biden, stronger, deeper, more sustained, earlier leadership on these issues. Biden has a long history he was a leading proponent of public financing of campaigns, for example, throughout almost his entire Senate career.
Yeah.
He cares a lot about voting rights. He understands these things more than many. But in 2021, they prioritized the Build Back Better and other things of that nature. And that was the strategic choice they made. I can't say that it necessarily was the wrong choice, but it did make it harder when the time came to get the democracy reform legislation over the finish line.
And I appreciate us talking about this. I do want to talk about the book, and we'll go over time if that works for you. But I also don't want to only talk about the book because we want people to read the book and buy the book. The Steny Hoyer thing, I'm reminded about the difference, and it's a great illustration, because one of my questions is going to be your advice for people working in states and localities, right? And the Steny Hoyer example, Representative Hoyer came to our state because we were placed with a bunch of swing district congressional candidates, in the last election. And he was the headliner of a fundraiser. and for all of the swing, there's a set of, it was 4 women all running as Democrats for Congress, and it came for for the big fundraiser of them all together. And he got up there, and I was standing next to somebody who was a philanthropic fundraiser, and somebody who cared about politics and who raised money, and she was there giving money and whatever. And he gets up to talk, and she taps me on the shoulder, and she says, "Jeff, who's that?" And that's Steny Hoyer, who's the majority leader of the House of Representatives. That in his mind, he is the most important thing out there, and everybody knows what's going on in his world. And and in the hallways of the Capitol building, that is absolutely true. And to use your term, in the kitchen tables of the United States of America, some people, but not everybody, including some pretty politically passionate people. So when we think about states, and you talk about failure, I talked about the example of women's suffrage. Women's suffrage happened state by state before it ever happened nationally. As we think about opportunities to pass, as you say, small dollar public matching or public financing for elections as what you think may be the biggest priority. And one way to do that might be national elections, but one way to do it, as you did it in New York, is not just state by state, but city by city. What is your advice for people working at the state or local level on what they should be prioritizing, what they should be looking to, or if they don't have an End Citizens United, and I appreciate the mapping that you helped us do, or some of the adding pieces to that map, what's your advice to them, including either what to win, how to win, or what to build?
I think there needs to be an explicitly political component. In New York, for example, the Working Families Party over many years was supportive strongly of a lot of these reforms, and made a big difference. Now, New York has fusion voting, so the position of the Working Families Party was unusually strong in that they could endorse Democratic or Republican candidates, and not just have to run their own third-party candidates. I think that there needs to be grassroots efforts, and this is the kind of thing Stacey Abrams has worked on. I think there needs to be a continued legal fight, although by legal meaning in the courts, we have to be aware that the fight is increasingly going to be in state courts. This is one of the responses to the changes at the federal courts and the changes in the U.S. Supreme Court that I write about in the book, which is people don't realize 49 out of 50 state constitutions has a stronger protection for the right to vote than the U.S. Constitution does, for example. They just have tended to interpret this and many other things kind of the way, however the federal courts have interpreted them. So it's a long-term effort to encourage the states, state courts, state activists, scholars to decouple that understanding so that states step forward as a bulwark for protection of equality and political equality and rights, and the other things that we wish the U.S. Supreme Court, we wish the federal courts were going to step up for, but which they're not. One of the things that I learned in looking at the country's history, the U.S. Supreme Court most of the time kind of hugs the middle. It pretty much reflects whatever the consensus is, at least among the governing elites of the country. And it's been that way going back to the beginning, and probably that isn't really a surprise. This is an institution, the U.S. Supreme Court, that isn't given a lot of power explicitly by the Constitution. It only has the power it has because we give it that power. We choose to treat it as though it's above politics. Yeah. And when the Supreme Court oversteps, when it overreaches, when it is extreme or partisan or unduly activist, there's a massive backlash. It's only happened 3 times in a real way in the country's history. But when that backlash happens, it has reshaped politics. It happened after the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which was the notorious ruling that said that Congress could not bar slavery in the territories outside the South. And the backlash was so convulsive that led to the rise of the Republican Party. It led to the election of Abraham Lincoln as president, and in a lot of ways led to the Civil War, which ultimately did end slavery. You had a similar backlash in the early 20th century. That was the period when the Supreme Court and the justices on the court thought their job was to protect property and to stop government from acting at a time of industrialization, of great wealth concentration, of social change, of immigration, to stop government from stepping in to protect worker safety, women, all those other things. And the Supreme Court concocted some doctrines that said that all that was unconstitutional. As you know, lawyers call this the Lochner era, after a particularly notorious case. But it wasn't just one case. I didn't realize this till I researched the book. The famous 1912 presidential election, which was the one where Theodore Roosevelt ran again and challenged his handpicked successor, Taft, and they were facing off against Woodrow Wilson and also Eugene Debs, the socialist. It's quite an extraordinary election. Theodore Roosevelt's big issue was the Supreme Court and its conservatism, and actually the Lochner case. And he rallied millions of people behind this. And actually, he had some kind of wacky ideas of what to do about it. He thought there ought to be ballot initiatives every time a court made a constitutional ruling to strike down a law, whatever. And he didn't win. But this was the central political issue. And then when his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, if you're a Supreme Court justice, you don't want to mess with those Roosevelt boys. When his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, did the New Deal, and the Supreme Court struck down the New Deal agencies over and over and over again, and they were about to rule on the Social Security Act, they were about to rule on the labor laws. And at that point, after having the biggest electoral victory in history, Roosevelt made his move and tried to expand the court, tried to persuade Congress to expand the court. As you know, it was a huge fight, court packing. And Roosevelt lost and really demolished the Democratic coalition at that point, although the court backed down. And so this was something that went on for decades. Now, the third time in the country's history was in the aftermath of the Warren Court. And I like the Warren Court. So much of what it did, we're sitting in an office named after Justice Brennan, for example. But and of course, what it did in Brown versus Board of Education and so many other great cases was vitally necessary. But the fact is, the amount of change that went on in the country, and the court was ahead of the country on a lot of these things, helped provoke a backlash. And we're still living in that backlash. I think we're at the beginnings of that kind of backlash now, in the wake of just last June, around this time of year, we saw the court in 3 days crammed decades of social change into those 3 days with 3 major cases. There was the Bruin case, which was by far the most extreme Second Amendment ruling in the country's history, saying that you could not take public safety into account when looking to see whether the individual right to gun ownership, which has only, by the way, been recognized by the Supreme Court since 2008, like even assuming that that's true, you couldn't take public safety into account. You couldn't balance that against public safety. You had to only look at history and tradition, meaning if there was a gun law on the books in 1791, then we might be able to have that same law now. I don't think they had plastic ghost guns made on 3D printers back then, let alone a lot of other assault weapons. The next day was the Dobbs case. And that, of course, overturned Roe v. Wade and Casey and undid the constitutional protection for women's reproductive rights, which we'd had for a half century, but also put at risk all the other privacy rights that people have come to rely on. And the day after that was a case that's less known called West Virginia versus EPA. That was a case that significantly began to curb the power of regulatory agencies to protect the environment. That was a climate change case, and protect public safety. And we're going to see the Supreme Court next term take on cases that very likely are going to go even further in hobbling government's ability to protect the public, claiming it's a constitutional analysis. So The court has gone way, way, way to the extreme, and I think we're starting to see a really big backlash. You saw it, of course, in the midterm election, the strongest midterm performance by a party in control of the White House in decades. But you even saw it in more direct and dramatic ways, I would say, in the Wisconsin Supreme Court election recently. Wisconsin, as you know, is a really closely divided state. It's always really tightly, the vote totals are split. Now, it's very severely gerrymandered, so the Republicans have supermajority control of the legislature there, but the public is 50-50. Then there was this vote on state Supreme Court justice, and as you know, most states elect their justices. Whether that's a good idea or not is a different issue, but they do. And they had the election. It became basically a de facto referendum on the Supreme Court, on the direction of the courts, on the Dobbs case, and on redistricting and gerrymandering. And it went from a 50-50 electorate to an 11-point win for the more liberal candidate. Political scientists will tell you that kind of thing doesn't happen. And if it happens over and over again, that's an earthquake. That's a realignment. And so this Supreme Court has loosed the whirlwind of the public's response, and it's only now going to begin to be felt.
Helping that, understanding that view of history is fascinating. And I heard you say those three areas: the after Dred Scott leading, and I will soften my language as you did, but certainly a precursor to the Civil War, the Lochner era, which presupposed the rise of the Progressive Era and the New Deal, and or was in the midst of it, and the Warren Court. I have thought of the Lochner era as more reactive than proactive, right? As that it was the gasp of centralized economic power who had the Supreme Court trying to keep back the backlash of the vicissitudes of the industrial age, right? And nonetheless, it still fits within your narrative, and I don't say that to cheapen it, but your narrative of when the Supreme Court departs from roughly the center of people's lives, roughly with what seems sort of in the main, roughly with what we sort of think judges are supposed to do, it's a big deal. And it's not just a big deal leftward or rightward, it's just a big deal political word. And that right now we might be in the Brune-Dobbs era, right? We might be at the dawn of the Citizens United, Brune-Dobbs, West Virginia versus EPA era. And that's a fascinating way to sort of understand and maybe anticipate what's happening politically. And by the way, certainly where we were earlier in our conversation with the previous midterm election is indicative of that, right? I mean, it was the Dobbs decision, although people still said the words Roe versus Wade more often, the Dobbs decision was very much in their mind. What were some of the circumstances, details about the case and decisions that might be interested to listeners who might be democracy nerds, but might not have caught all of the elements of that a Supreme Court watcher would catch? What were, for instance, Alito cited Matthew Hale, a 17th century jurist. What are some of the nuggets? I loved your Steny Hoyer, forgive me, story, for example. What are some of the nuggets within those cases that might interest people?
Well, I think that Matthew Hale example is an interesting one. It sounds like a parody when they cited 6 times this guy Matthew Hale, who was an English jurist who sentenced women to death for witchcraft, and who actually invented the doctrine of marital rape, meaning the man could not be prosecuted for the rape of his wife because she had given herself over or whatever. And when the Dobbs opinion leaked in May of last year, it was explosive. And one of the things that was explosive was how reactionary it was in citing things like this as why we couldn't have reproductive rights in 2023. This guy was from the 1600s in England, in a different country, I should note. that weekend, Saturday Night Live did a parody about the Dobbs leak with Benedict Cumberbatch and others in costume, period costume. And I'm sure the listeners, the viewers, didn't realize it was funny, but it was actually literally what the opinion said. It was extraordinary. What this was a really vivid marker of is the court's extremist embrace of originalism. And I don't think, again, people understand quite so directly that originalism, the idea the only legitimate way to interpret the Constitution is to ask what it meant the day it was written, meaning in 1791, or sometimes maybe when the 14th Amendment was written in 1868, that's the only legitimate way to interpret the Constitution today. And what that really literally means is that the views and prejudices and social impulses of property owning white men in 1791 are all you're allowed to follow today in 2023, no matter how much the country has changed. Back then, women could not vote. Black people were enslaved. People used leeches for medical care and many other things. And it's a crazy way to live. It's no way to run a railroad, but that is actually what these opinions rely on. Matthew Hale was in the Dobbs case. In the Bruin case, the gun case, again, they said, well, the originalism in the gun case was also kind of fake, because I wrote a book on the history of the Second Amendment and the Heller case from 2008, and people did have handguns in their homes, back in the day, although they didn't think they were putting that into the Constitution necessarily. They thought they were enshrining the militias, which were the local public defense force that all men, eventually all white men aged 16 to 60, were required by law to join, were required by law to own a gun and bring it from home. That's what they thought the Second Amendment was about back then. But anyway, there was a history of people having weapons for self-protection, some people. There's also a very long history of laws banning the carrying of weapons or strictly limiting them all throughout the country's history. So when Clarence Thomas said, "Oh, history tells us we can't do this," he was making up the history. But the way the courts have interpreted the Bruin decision, because other courts then get the job of interpreting what or statements the Supreme Court makes, are just as much sounding like a satire as that Saturday Night Live sketch. In upstate New York, a federal judge looked at the law that was passed by the New York State legislature after the Bruin case, trying to have some meaningful gun regulation in New York State. And the judge said, well, history and tradition, 2 examples from colonial era laws, that's a mere trend. For it to be a tradition, you need 3. And I can find no tradition of laws banning guns at sleepaway summer camps, which didn't exist, of course. Therefore, that's unconstitutional, let alone subways, underground electric trains, which would not be
subway regulation was way behind
in the
early 1800s.
1790s. Of course, it wasn't for another century that they invented them. And this sounds like a joke, but this is actually how they ruled. So that's also unconstitutional. In Texas, the appeals court of the federal Fifth Circuit Appeals Court ruled that the law saying you can take away a gun from a man who's been found by court to engage in domestic abuse, that's not constitutional, because, hey, back then, people thought there was nothing wrong with that. We can't find any laws from back then doing that. Again, when women, among many other things, women couldn't vote. So our country, if we continue to follow this path, and we will know a lot more in the decisions at the end of this term in June of this year, this period we're entering into now, it is an actual effort to try to govern our country, to turn back literally the clock to centuries ago as the basis for the social values we live in. And I just think that the country is not going to stand it. It's going to lead to a constant tension as the court goes in one direction, the country evolves in another direction. It will, as it has already begun to do, lead to, I think, a crisis of legitimacy, and will create the backlash to this supermajority, just the same as we had the backlash to the Lochner Court or Dred Scott or other things as well. So I think this is going to be one of the defining things for our politics going forward. Again, these basic issues of voting, money in politics, and democracy. John Roberts is an institutionalist. He's sometimes not actually with the most extreme members of the supermajority. On those issues, he's the leader of the supermajority. That's the world they've created, and now we're all living in it, and we've got to fight it.
The book is a Supermajority, How the Supreme Court Divided America. I do want to put a plug in also for the portion of West Virginia versus EPA. The gun fights and abortion fights get a lot of ink. The West Virginia versus EPA might be the most consequential certainly in its effort to deconstruct the regulatory state that has allowed the American economy to thrive and for middle class to at least hold on during at least the middle of the last century. Before you, I'd welcome any comment on that. I know you have to go. You've got an organization to run, and we need you to do that because you got to go save democracy. Feel free to comment on West Virginia versus EPA, but I at least wanted a last word. When you say, and when I hear people say the Supreme Court will lose legitimacy, who cares? What does that actually mean? What is, and I mean, I understand like we care that we trust the Supreme Court, but how does that manifest itself? Does that mean there are laws and that get passed and the Congress starts interpreting the Constitution? As your last thought, if Supreme Court loses legitimacy, why do we care about that? And what does it mean?
Well, it means that we shouldn't just accept what they say as oracles or wizards, and even though they have robes, or religious figures, but understand they're making political decisions, and we can push back in all the ways we have at our disposal politically with our votes and our voices. You're right. West Virginia versus EPA was the first success in a long effort to find a constitutional justification for pushing back and cutting back on public safety regulation, going all the way back to 1937 at the end of that court packing fight. And what West Virginia versus EPA said was that if a regulatory agency acts and it's acting based on a law passed by Congress, following the rules, the words of the law passed by Congress, but that if it's a quote major question, then the agency can't act without Congress passing a law. And that means the Supreme Court and people like them throughout the federal courts chosen by the Federalist Society and others, those folks will decide what's a major question, and basically gives those judges who are acting in a pretty ideological way, that gives them the power to kind of just decide if they don't like a regulation, and they'll declare it unconstitutional. That's something some people pushing back against regulation of business have been hungering for decades. But there is a response that can come in a bunch of different ways. We saw it in part in response to West Virginia v. EPA. Just a month later, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act. That was the biggest climate change bill in American history. It didn't overturn the decision, although it did actually have some language in there to kind of trim the sails of the Supreme Court. But it passed, massive amounts of spending and significant policy changes on climate change. They found a way to push back. Sometimes the Supreme Court acts and Congress can specifically, explicitly overturn what the Supreme Court has done. The legislation, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, for example, part of the Freedom of Vote Act, was aiming to overturn the rulings by the Supreme Court about the text of the Voting Rights Act. Congress has that power to do that. There's also other things people have in their control. We all act as though no one will ever amend the Constitution again. Nonsense. There's been many bursts of amendments passed by the country. They tend to go about every 50 years without a big one. And everyone says, oh, it's too hard. There's no way. It's never going to happen. And then things get bad enough, and there's a burst of amendments, and they're usually to strengthen democracy. You mentioned when women won the right to vote, or the poll tax was ended and the 18-year-old voting age was instituted, and a bunch of other things in the 1960s, we're well overdue for constitutional amendments. And if things get bad enough, you could see whether it's 18-year terms for Supreme Court justices, overturning Citizens United and other misguided campaign finance rulings and other things, you could see amendments there. And then finally, conservatives, just as they understood these democracy issues and didn't worry about them at the idea that they couldn't talk about them at their kitchen table, they've been talking about Roe v. Wade at the kitchen table for half a century. Democrats, liberals, progressives finally have to wake up to the centrality of these issues, not to try to get, better doctrine out of the Supreme Court or our favorite person necessarily appointed to the court, but to reform the court, to impose term limits, to impose an ethics code, and to start insisting that the politicians prioritize these issues if they're running for office and want our support. Until very, very recently, the last thing I'll say, until very recently, polling showed that Democrats, liberals, had a much higher opinion of the U.S. Supreme Court than conservatives did, till about 2 years ago. After Citizens United, after Shelby County. Why was that? I think probably the Obergefell case, which respected marriage equality, and the lingering aftermath of Brown v. Board of Education and Roe v. Wade and other things. But in any case, I think that people's understanding has changed quite a bit. And so at least there's a moment now of clarity that can lead to action. And at least I hope that's what's going to happen. And thanks for the chance to talk about all of this.
Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University, author of the book, The Supermajority, How the Supreme Court Divided America.